Was he really watching as he should do? He had been wool gathering. There were no such things as spirits. Mediums were humbugs, and he was here to prove that soul remained in gospel. But he must keep up with things. He was missing points. What was that scent of violets? And who had set the musical box going? The medium, of course, but how? He tried to recall whether he had heard a rustling or detected any movement before the music began. He could not recollect. Come, he must be more on the alert than this. He became acutely desirous of a successful exposure. He figured the dramatic moment he had prepared with Smithers, Ethel a spectator. He peered suspiciously into the darkness. Somebody shuddered again, someone opposite him this time. He felt Lagoon's finger quiver still more palpably, and then suddenly the raps began abruptly all about him. Rap making him start violently. A swift percussive sound, tap, rap, tap. Under the table, under the chair, in the air, round the cornices. The medium groaned again and shuddered, and his nervous agitation passed sympathetically round the circle. The music seemed to fade to the vanishing point and grew louder again. How was it done? He heard Lagoon's voice next to him, speaking with a peculiar quality of breathless reverence. The alphabet? He asked. Shall we use the alphabet? A forcible rap under the table. No, interrupted the voice of the medium. The raps were continued everywhere. Of course, it was trickery. Lewisham endeavoured to think what the mechanism was. He tried to determine whether he really had the medium's little finger touching his. He peered at the dark shape next to him. There was a violent rapping far away behind them with an almost metallic resonance. Then the rap ceased, and over the healing silence, the little jet of melody from the musical box played alone, and after a moment that ceased also. The stillness was profound. Mr. Lewisham was now highly strung. Doubts assailed him suddenly, and an overwhelming apprehension, a sense of vast occurrences gathering above him. The darkness was a physical oppression. He started. Something had stirred on the table. There was a sharp ping of metal being struck, a number of little crepitating sounds like paper being smoothed, the sound of wind without a movement of air, a sense of a presence hovering over the table. The excitement of Lagoon communicated itself in convulsive tremblings. The medium's hand quivered. In the darkness of the table, something faintly luminous, a greenish-white patch, stirred and hopped slowly among the dim shapes. The object, whatever it was, hopped higher, rose slowly in the air, expanded. Lewisham's attention followed this slavishly. It was ghostly, unaccountable, marvellous. For the moment he forgot even Ethel. Higher and higher this pallid luminosity rose overhead. And then he saw that it was a ghostly hand and arm, rising and rising, slowly, deliberately across the table, seemed to touch Lagoon, who shivered. It moved slowly round and touched Lewisham. He gritted his teeth. There was no mistaking the touch, firm and yet soft, of fingertips. Almost simultaneously, Miss Haydinger cried out that something was smoothing her hair, and suddenly the musical box set off again with a reel. The faint oval of the tambourine rose, jangled, and Lewisham heard it pat Smithers in the face. It seemed to pass overhead. Immediately, a table somewhere beyond the medium began moving audibly on its casters. It seemed impossible that the medium, sitting so still beside him, could be doing all these things, grotesquely unmeaning though they might be after all. The ghostly hand was hovering almost directly in front of Mr. Lewisham's eyes. It hung with a slight quivering. Ever and again its fingers flapped down and rose stiffly again. Noise, a loud noise it seemed, something moving. What was it he had to do? Lewisham suddenly missed the medium's little finger. He tried to recover it. He could not find it. He caught, held, and lost an arm. There was an exclamation, a faint report, a curse close to him bitten in half by the quick effort to suppress it. The little pinpoint of light flew up with a hiss. Lewisham, standing, saw a circle of blinking faces turn to the group of two this sizzling light revealed. Smithers was the chief figure of the group. He stood triumphant, one hand on the gas tap, the other gripping the medium's wrist, and in the medium's hand, the incriminatory tambourine. "How's this, Lewisham?" cried Smithers, with the shadows on his face jumping as the gas flared. "Caught," said Lewisham loudly, rising in his place and avoiding Ethel's eyes. "What's this?" cried the medium. "Cheating," panted Smithers. "Not so," cried the medium. "When you turned up the light, put my hand up, caught tambourine to save head." "Mr. Smithers," cried Lagoon. "Mr. Smithers, this is very wrong. This... shock." The tambourine fell noisily to the floor. The medium's face changed. He groaned strangely and staggered back. Lagoon cried out for a glass of water. Everyone looked at the man, expecting him to fall, save Lewisham. The thought of Ethel had flashed back into his mind. He turned to see how she took this exposure in which he was such a prominent actor. He saw her leaning over the table as if to pick up something that lay across it. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the medium. Her face was set and white. Then, as if she felt his glance, her eyes met his. She started back, stood erect, facing him with a strange hardness in her eyes. In the moment, Lewisham did not grasp the situation. He wanted to show that he was acting upon equal terms with Smithers in the exposure. For the moment, her action simply directed his attention to the object towards which she had been leaning, a thing of shriveled membrane, a pneumatic glove lying on the table. This was evidently part of the mediumistic apparatus. He pounced and seized it. "Look," he said, holding it towards Smithers. "He is more. What is this?" He perceived that the girl started. He saw Chaffery, the medium, look instantly over Smithers' shoulder, saw his swift glance of reproach at the girl. Abruptly, the situation appeared to Lewisham. He perceived her complicitly, and he stood still in the attitude of triumph, with the evidence against her in his hand. But his triumph had vanished. "Ah!" cried Smithers, leaning across the table to secure it. "Good old Lewisham, now we have it. This is better than the tambourine." His eyes shone with triumph. "Do you see, Mr. Lagoon?" said Smithers. The medium held this in his teeth and blew it out. "There's no denying this. This wasn't falling on your head, Mr. Medium, was it? This was the luminous hand." Chapter 12. Lewisham is unaccountable. That night, as she went with him to Chelsea Station, Miss Haydinger discovered an extraordinary moodiness in Lewisham. She had been vividly impressed by the scene in which they had just participated. She had for a time believed in the manifestations. The swift exposure had violently revolutionized her ideas. The details of the crisis were a little confused in her mind. She ranked Lewisham with Smithers in the scientific triumph of the evening. On the whole, she felt elated. She had no objection to being confuted by Lewisham, but she was angry with the medium. "It is dreadful," she said, "living a lie. How can the world grow better when sane, educated people use their sanity and enlightenment to darken others? It is dreadful." He was a horrible man, such an oily, dishonest voice. And the girl, I was sorry for her. She must have been, bitterly ashamed. Why should she have burst out crying? That did distress me. Fancy crying like that. It was, yes, abandon. But what can one do? She paused. Lewisham was walking along, looking straight before him, lost in some grim argument with himself. "It makes me think of Sludge, the medium," she said. He made no answer. She glanced at him suddenly. "Have you read Sludge the medium, eh?" he said, coming back out of infinity. "What? I beg your pardon? Sludge the medium. I thought his name was... It was Chaffery." He looked at her, clearly very anxious upon this question of fact. "But I mean Browning's Sludge. You know the poem." "No, I'm afraid I don't," said Lewisham. "I must lend it to you," she said. "It's splendid. It goes to the very bottom of this business." "Does it?" "It never occurred to me before, but I see the point clearly now. If people, poor people, are offered money if phenomena happen, it's too much. They are bound to cheat. It's bribery, immorality." She talked in panting little sentences because Lewisham was walking in heedless big strides. I wonder how much such people could earn honestly. Lewisham slowly became aware of the question at his ear. He hurried back from infinity. How much they could earn honestly? I haven't the slightest idea. He paused. The whole of this business puzzles me, he said. I want to think. It's frightfully complex, isn't it? She said, a little staggered. But the rest of the way to the station was silence. They parted with a hand clasp. They took pride in, a little perfunctory so far as Lewisham was concerned on this occasion. She scrutinized his face as the train moved out of the station and tried to account for his mood. He was staring before him at unknown things as if he had already forgotten her. He wanted to think, but 2 heads, she thought, were better than 1 in a matter of opinion. It troubled her to be so ignorant of his mental states. How we are wrapped and swathed about, soul from soul, she thought, staring out of the window at the dim things flying by outside. Suddenly, a fit of depression came upon her. She felt alone, absolutely alone, in a void world. Presently, she returned to external things. She became aware of 2 people in the next compartment, eyeing her critically. Her hand went patting at her hair. Chapter 13. Lewisham Insists. Ethel Henderson sat at her machine before the window of Mr. Lagoon's study and stared blankly at the greys and blues of the November twilight. Her face was white, her eyelids were red from recent weeping, and her hands lay motionless in her lap. The door had just slammed behind Lagoon. "Hi-ho," she said. "I wish I was dead. Oh, I wish I was out of it all." She became passive again. "I wonder what I have done," she said, "that I should be punished like this." She certainly looked anything but a fate-haunted soul, being indeed visibly and immediately a very pretty girl. Her head was shapely and covered with curly dark hair, and her eyebrows above her hazel eyes were clear and dark. Her lips were finely shaped. Her mouth was not too small to be expressive, her chin small, and her neck white and full and pretty. There is no need to lay stress upon her nose, it sufficed. She was of a mediocre height, sturdy rather than slender, and her dress was of a pleasant golden brown material with the easy sleeves and graceful line of those aesthetic days, and she sat at her typewriter and wished she was dead and wondered what she had done. The room was lined with bookshelves, and conspicuous therein were a long row of foolish, pretentious volumes, the works of Lagoon, the witless, meandering imitation of philosophy that occupied his life. Along the cornices were busts of Plato, Socrates, and Newton. Behind Ethel was the great man's desk, with its green-shaded electric light, and littered with proofs and copies of Hesperus, a paper for doubters which, with her assistance, he edited, published, compiled, wrote, and, without her help, paid for and read. A pen flung down forcibly quivered erect with its one surviving nib in the blotting pad. Mr. Lagoon had flung it down. The collapse of the previous night had distressed him dreadfully, and ever and again before his retreat he had been breaking into passionate monologue. The ruin of a life work it was, no less. Surely she had known that Chaffrey was a cheat. Had she not known? Silence. After so many kindnesses. She interrupted him with a wailing, "Oh, I know. But Lagoon was remorseless and insisted she had betrayed him. Worse, made him ridiculous. Look at the work he had undertaken at South Kensington. How could he go on with that now? How could he find the heart when his own typewriter sacrificed him to her stepfather's trickery? Trickery! The gesticulating hands became active, the grey eyes dilated with indignation, the piping voice eloquent. If he hadn't cheated you, someone else would. was Ethel's inadequate muttered retort, unheard by the seeker after phenomena. It was perhaps not so bad as dismissal, but it certainly lasted longer, and at home was Chaffery grimly malignant at her failure to secure that pneumatic glove. He had no right to blame her, he really had not, but a disturbed temper is apt to falsify the scales of justice. The tambourine, he insisted, he could have explained by saying he put up his hand to catch it and protect his head directly when Smithers moved. But the pneumatic glove, there was no explaining. He had made a chance for her to secure it when he had pretended to faint. It was rubbish to say anyone could have been looking on the table then. Rubbish. Beside that significant wreck of a pen stood a little carriage clock in a case, and this suddenly lifted a slender voice and announced 5. She turned round on her stool and sat staring at the clock. She smiled with the corners of her mouth. "Home," she said, "and begin again. It's like battledore and shuttlecock. I was silly, I suppose. I've brought it on myself. I ought to have picked it up, I suppose. I had time. Cheats, just cheats. I never thought I should see him again. He was ashamed, of course. He had his own friends." For a space she sat still, staring blankly before her. She sighed, rubbed a knuckle in a reddened eye, rose. She went into the hall where her hat, transfixed by a couple of hat pins, hung above her jacket, assumed these garments, and let herself out into the cold, grey street. She had hardly gone 20 yards from Lagoon's door before she became aware of a man overtaking her and walking beside her. That kind of thing is a common enough experience to girls who go to and from work in London, and she had had perforce to learn many things since her adventurous Wortley days. She looked stiffly in front of her. The man deliberately got in her way so that she had to stop. She lifted her eyes of indignant protest. It was Lewisham, and his face was white. He hesitated awkwardly, and then, in silence, held out his hand. She took it mechanically. He found his voice. "Miss Henderson," he said. "What do you want?" she asked faintly. "I don't know," he said. "I want to talk to you." "Yes?" Her heart was beating fast. He found the thing unexpectedly difficult. "May I? Are you expecting? Have you far to go? I would like to talk to you. There is a lot." "I walk to Clapham," she said, "if you care to come part of the way." She moved awkwardly. Lewisham took his place at her side. They walked side by side for a moment, their manner constrained, having so much to say that they could not find a word to begin upon. "Have you forgotten Wortley?" she asked abruptly. "No." He glanced at her. Her face was downcast. "Why did you never write?" he asked bitterly. "I wrote. Again, I mean. I did, in July. I never had it. It came back. But Miss Monday, I had forgotten her name. I sent it to the grammar school." Lewisham expressed an exclamation. "I am very sorry," she said. They went on again in silence. "Last night," said Lewisham at length, "I have no business to ask, but—" She took a long breath. "Mr. Lewisham," she said, "that man you saw, the medium, was my stepfather." "Well, isn't that enough?" Lewisham paused. "No," he said. There was another constrained silence. "No," he said less dubiously. "I don't care a rap about what your stepfather is. Were you cheating?" Her face turned white. Her mouth opened and closed. "Mr. Lewisham," she said deliberately, "you may not believe it. It may sound impossible, but on my honour, I did not know for certain. That is, that my stepfather—" "Ah," said Lewisham, leaping at conviction. "Then I was right." For a moment she stared at him, and then, "I did know," she said, suddenly, beginning to cry. "How can I tell you? It is a lie. I did know all the time." He stared at her in white astonishment. He fell behind her one step, and then in a stride came level again. Then a silence that it seemed would never end. She had stopped crying. She was one huge suspense, not daring even to look at his face. and at last he spoke. "No," he said slowly, "I don't mind even that. I don't care, even if it was that." Abruptly they turned into the King's Road, with its roar of wheeled traffic and hurrying foot passengers, and forthwith a crowd of boys with a broken-spirited guy involved and separated them. In a busy highway of a night, one must needs talk disconnectedly in shouted snatches or else hold one's peace. He glanced at her face and saw that it was set again. Presently she turned southward, out of the tumult, in the street of darkness and warm blinds, and they could go on talking again. "I understand what you mean," said Lewisham. "I know I do. You knew, but you do not want to know. It was like that." But her mind had been active. "At the end of this road," she said, gulping a sob, "you must go back. It was kind of you to come, Mr. Lewisham, but you were ashamed. You are sure to be ashamed. My employer is a spiritualist, and my stepfather is a professional medium, and my mother is a spiritualist. You were quite right not to speak to me last night. Quite. It was kind of you to come, but you must go back. Life is hard enough as it is. You must go back at the end of the road. Go back at the end of the road." Lewisham made no reply for 100 yards. "I'm coming on to Clapham," he said. They came to the end of the road in silence. Then at the curb corner she turned and faced him. "Go back," she whispered. "No," he said obstinately. And they stood face to face at the cardinal point of their lives. "Listen to me," said Lewisham. "It is hard to say what I feel. I don't know myself, but I'm not going to lose you like this. I'm not going to let you slip a second time. I was awake about it all last night. I don't care where you are, what your people are, nor very much whether you've kept quite clear of this medium humbug. I don't. You will in future, anyhow. I've had a day and night to think it over. I had to come and try to find you. It's you. I've never forgotten you. Never. I'm not going to be sent back like this. It can be no good for either of us," she said, as resolute as he. "I shan't leave you. But what is the good?" "I'm coming," said Lewisham dogmatically, and he came. He asked her a question point blank, and she would not answer him, and for some way they walked in grim silence. Presently she spoke with a twitching mouth. "I wish you would leave me," she said. "You are quite different from what I am. You felt that last night. You helped find us out. When first I came to London, I used to wander about Clapham looking for you," said Lewisham, "week after week." They had crossed the bridge and were in a narrow little street of shabby shops near Clapham Junction before they talked again. She kept her face averted and expressionless. "I'm sorry," said Lewisham with a sort of stiff civility, "if I seem to be forcing myself upon you. I don't want to pry into your affairs, if you don't wish me to. The sight of you has somehow brought back a lot of things. I can't explain it. Perhaps I had to come to find you. I kept on thinking of your face, of how you used to smile, how you jumped from the gate by the lock, and how we had tea. A lot of things." He stopped again. "A lot of things." "If I may come," he said, and went unanswered. They crossed the wide streets by the junction and went on towards the common. "I live down this road," she said, stopping abruptly at a corner. "I would rather—" "But I have said nothing." She looked at him with her face white, unable to speak for a space. "It can do no good," she said. "I am mixed up with this." She stopped. He spoke deliberately. "I shall come," he said, "tomorrow night." "No," she said. "But I shall come." "No," she whispered. "I shall come." She could hide the gladness of her heart from herself no longer. She was frightened that he had come, but she was glad, and he knew that she was glad. She made no further protest. She held out her hand dumbly. And on the morrow she found him awaiting her, even as he had said. Chapter 14. Mr. Lagoon's Point of View. For 3 days, the laboratory at South Kensington saw nothing of Lagoon, and then he came back more invincibly voluble than ever. Everyone had expected him to return apostate, but he brought back an invigorated faith, a propaganda unashamed. And from source he had derived strength and conviction afresh. Even the rhetorical Smithers availed nothing. There was a joint battle over the insufficient teacups, and the elderly young assistant demonstrator hovered on the verge of the discussion, rejoicing, it is supposed, over the entanglements of Smithers. For at the outset, Smithers displayed an overweening confidence and civility, and at the end his ears were red and his finer manners lost to him. Lewisham, it was remarked by Miss Haydinger, made a poor figure in this discussion. Once or twice he seemed about to address Lagoon, and thought better of it, with the words upon his lips. Lagoon's treatment of the exposure was light and vigorous. "The man Chaffery," he said, "has made a clean breast of it. His point of view." "Facts are facts," said Smithers. "A fact is a synthesis of impressions," said Lagoon, "but that you will learn when you are older. The thing is that we are at cross purposes. I told Chaffery you were beginners. He treated you as beginners, arranged a demonstration." "It was a demonstration," said Smithers. "Precisely, if it had not been for your interruptions." "Ah, he forged elementary effects. You can't but admit that. I don't attempt to deny it, but as he explained, the thing is necessary, justifiable. Psychic phenomena are subtle. A certain training of the observation is necessary. A medium is a more subtle instrument than a balance or a borax bead. And see how long it is before you can get assured results with a borax bead. In the elementary class, in the introductory phase, conditions are too crude for honesty." "Wait a moment. Is it dishonest, rigging a demonstration?" "Of course it is. Your professors do it." "I deny that in toto," said Smithers, and repeated with satisfaction, "in toto." "That's all right," said Lagoon, "because I have the facts. Your chemical lecturers, you may go downstairs now and ask if you disbelieve me, always cheat over the indestructibility of matter experiment. Always. And then another, a physiography thing. You know the experiment I mean? To demonstrate the existence of the Earth's rotation, they use Foucault's pendulum," said Lewisham. "They use a rubber ball with a pinhole hidden in the hand and blow the pendulum round the way it ought to go." "But that's different," said Smithers. "Wait a moment," said Lagoon, and produced a piece of folded printed paper from his pocket. "Here is a review from Nature of the work of no less a person than Professor Greenhill. And see, a convenient pin is introduced in the apparatus for the demonstration of virtual velocities. Read it if you doubt me. I suppose you doubt me." Smithers abruptly abandoned his position of denial in toto. "This isn't my point, Mr. Lagoon. This isn't my point," he said. "These things that are done in the lecture theatre are not to prove facts, but to give ideas." "So was my demonstration," said Lagoon. "We didn't understand it in that light." "Nor does the ordinary person who goes to science lectures understand it in that light. He is confronted by the thought that he is seeing things with his own eyes." "Well, I don't care," said Smithers. "Two wrongs don't make a right. To rig demonstrations is wrong." "There I agree with you. I have spoken plainly with this man, Chaffery. He's not a full-blown professor, you know, a highly salaried ornament of the Rock of Truth like your demonstration-rigging professors here, and so I can speak plainly to him without offence. He takes quite the view they would take, but I am more rigorous. I insist that there shall be no more of this." "Next time," said Smithers with irony. "There will be no next time. I have done with elementary exhibitions. You must take the word of the trained observer, just as you do in the matter of chemical analysis. Do you mean you are going on with that chap when he's been caught cheating under your very nose?" "Certainly, why not?" Smithers set out to explain why not, and happened on confusion. "I still believe the man has powers," said Lagoon. "Of deception," said Smithers. "Those I must eliminate," said Lagoon. "You might as well refuse to study electricity because it escaped through your body. All new science is elusive. No investigator in his senses would refuse to investigate a compound because it did unexpected things. Either this dissolves in acid or, I have nothing more to do with it, eh? That's fine research. Then it was the last vestiges of Smithers' manners vanished. I don't care what you say, said Smithers. It's all rot. It's all just rot. Argue if you like, but have you convinced anybody? Put it to the vote. That's democracy with a vengeance, said Lagoon. A general election of the truth, half yearly, eh? That's simply wriggling out of it, said Smithers. That hasn't anything to do with it at all. Lagoon, flushed but cheerful, was on his way downstairs when Lewisham overtook him. He was pale and out of breath, but as the staircase invariably rendered Lagoon breathless, he did not remark the younger man's disturbance. Interesting talk, panted Lewisham. Very interesting talk, sir. I'm glad you found it so. Very, said Lagoon. There was a pause, and then Lewisham plunged desperately. There is a young lady, she is your typewriter. He stopped from sheer loss of breath. Yes, said Lagoon. Is she a medium or anything of that sort? Well, Lagoon reflected, she is not a medium, certainly, but why do you ask? Oh, I wondered. You noticed her eyes, perhaps. She is the stepdaughter of that man, Chaffrey, a queer character, but indisputably mediumistic. It's odd the thing should have struck you. Curiously enough, I have myself fancied she might be something of a psychic, judging from her face. A what? A psychic. Undeveloped, of course. I have thought once or twice. Only a little while ago I was speaking to that man Chaffrey about her. Were you? Yes, he, of course, would like to see any latent powers developed. But it's a little difficult to begin, you know. You mean she won't? Not at present. She is a good girl, but in this matter she is timid. There is often a sort of disinclination, a queer sort of feeling, one might almost call it, modesty. I see, said Lewisham. One can override it usually. I don't despair. No, said Lewisham shortly. They were at the foot of the staircase now. He hesitated. You've given me a lot to think about, he said, with an attempt at an offhand manner. The way you talked upstairs, and turned towards the book he had to sign. I'm glad you don't take up quite so much an intolerant attitude as Mr. Smithers, said Lagoon. Very glad. I must lend you a book or two, if your cramming here leaves you any time, that is. Thanks, said Lewisham shortly, and walked away from him. The studiously characteristic signature quivered and sprawled in an unfamiliar manner. I'm damned if he overrides it, said Lewisham, under his breath. Chapter 15. Love in the Streets. Lewisham was not quite clear what course he meant to take in the high enterprise of foiling Lagoon, and indeed he was anything but clear about the entire situation. His logical processes, his emotions, and his imagination seemed playing some sort of snatching game with his will. Enormous things hung imminent, but it worked out to this, that he walked home with Ethel night after night for, to be exact, 67 nights. Every week night through November and December, save once, when he had to go into the Far East to buy himself an overcoat, he was waiting to walk with her home. A curious, inconclusive affair, that walk, to which he came nightly full of vague longings, and which ended invariably under an odd shadow of disappointment. It began outside Lagoon's most punctually at 5, and ended mysteriously at the corner of a side road in Clapham, a road of little yellow houses with sunk basements and tawdry decorations of stone. Up that road she vanished night after night into a grey mist and the shadow beyond a feeble yellow gas lamp, and he would watch her vanish and then sigh and turn back towards his lodgings. They talked of this and that, their little superficial ideas about themselves, and of their circumstances and tastes, and always there was something that was with them unspoken, unacknowledged, which made all these things unreal and insincere. Yet out of their talk he began to form vague ideas of the home from which she came. There was, of course, no servant, and the mother was something meandering, furtive, tearful in the face of troubles. Sometimes, of an afternoon or evening, she grew garrulous. Mother does talk so sometimes. She rarely went out of doors. Chaffrey always rose late and would sometimes go away for days together. He was mean. He allowed only a weekly 25 shillings for housekeeping, and sometimes things grew unsatisfactory at the weekend. There seemed to be little sympathy between mother and daughter. The widow had been flighty in a dingy fashion, and her marriage with her chief lodger, Chaffrey, had led to unforgettable sayings. It was to facilitate this marriage that Ethel had been sent to Wortley, so that was counted a mitigated evil. But these were far-off things, remote and unreal down the long, ill-lit vista of the suburban street which swallowed up Ethel nightly. The walk, her warmth and light and motion close to him, her clear little voice and the touch of her hand, that was reality. The shadow of Chaffrey and his deceptions lay indeed across all these things, sometimes faint, sometimes dark and present. Then Lewisham became insistent, his sentimental memory ceased, and he asked questions that verged on gulfs of doubt. Had she never helped? She had not, she declared. Then she added that twice at home she had sat down to complete the circle. She would never help again. That she promised if it needed promising. There had already been dreadful trouble at home about the exposure of lagoons. Her mother had sided with her stepfather and joined in blaming her. But was she to blame? Of course you were not to blame, said Lewisham. Lagoon, he learnt, had been unhappy and restless for the 3 days after the séance, indulging in wearisome monologue, with Ethel as sole auditor at 21 shillings a week. Then he had decided to give Chaffrey a sound lecture on his disastrous dishonesty, but it was Chaffrey that gave the lecture. Smithers, had he only known it, had been overthrown by a better brain than Lagoon's, albeit spoke through Lagoon's treble. Ethel did not like talking of Chaffrey and these other things. If you knew how sweet it was to forget it all, she would say, to be just us two together for a little while. And what good does it do to keep on when Lewisham was pressing? Lewisham wanted very much to keep on at times, but the good of it was a little hard to demonstrate. So his knowledge of the situation remained imperfect, and the weeks drifted by. Wonderfully varied were those 67 nights, as he came to remember in afterlife. There were nights of damp and drizzle, and then thick fogs, beautiful, isolating grey-white veils, turning every yard of pavement into a private room. Grand indeed were these fogs, things to rejoice at mightily, since then it was no longer a thing for public scorn when 2 young people hurried along arm in arm, and one could do 1,000 impudent, significant things with varying pressure, and the fondling of a little hand, a hand in a greatly mended glove. Then indeed one seemed to be nearer that elusive something that threaded it all together. And the dangers of the street corners, the horses looming up suddenly out of the dark, the carters with lanterns at their horses' heads, the street lamps blurred smoky orange at one's nearest, and vanishing at 20 yards into dim haze, seemed to accentuate the infinite need of protection on the part of a delicate young lady who had already traversed 3 winters of fogs, thornily alone. Moreover, one could come right down the quiet street where she lived, halfway to the steps of her house, with a delightful sense of enterprise. The fogs passed all too soon into a hard frost, into nights of starlight, and presently moonlight, when the lamps looked hard, flashing like rows of yellow gems, and their reflections and the glare of the shop windows were sharp and frosty, and even the stars hard and bright, snapping noiselessly, if one may say so, instead of twinkling. A jacket trimmed with imitation astrakhan replaced Ethel's lighter coat, and a round cap of astrakhan her hat, and her eyes shone hard and bright, and her forehead was broad with white beneath it. It was exhilarating, but one got home too soon, and so the way from Chelsea to Clapham was lengthened, first into a loop of side streets, And then, when the first purulent snows told that Christmas was at hand, into a new loop down King's Road, and once even through the Brompton Road and Sloane Street, where the shops were full of decorations and entertaining things. And under circumstances of infinite gravity, Mr. Lewisham secretly spent 23 shillings out of the vestiges of that £100 and bought Ethel a little gold ring set with pearls. With that, there must needs to be a ceremonial, and on the verge of the snowy, foggy common, she took off her glove, and the ring was placed on her finger. Whereupon he was moved to kiss her on the frost-pink knuckle next to an inky nail. "It's silly of us," she said. "What can we do, ever?" "You wait," he said, and his tone was full of vague promises. Afterwards he thought over those promises, and another evening went into the matter more fully, telling her of all the brilliant things that he held it was possible for a South Kensington student to do and be of headmasterships, northern science schools, inspectorships, demonstratorships, yes, even professorships. And then, to all of which she lent a willing and incredulous ear, finding in that dreaming a quality of fear as well as delight. The putting on of the pearl-set ring was mere ceremonial, of course. She could not wear it either at Lagoon's or at home, so instead she threaded it on a little white satin ribbon and wore it round her neck, next to her heart. He thought of it there as warm, next to her heart. When he had bought the ring, he had meant to save it for Christmas before he gave it to her, but the desire to see her pleasure had been too strong for him. Christmas Eve, I know not by what deceit on her part, these young people spent together all day. Lagoon was down with a touch of bronchitis and had given his typewriter a holiday. Perhaps she forgot to mention it at home. The Royal College was in vacation and Lewisham was free. He declined the plumber's invitation. Work kept him in London, he said, though it meant £1 or more of added expenditure. These absurd young people walked 16 miles that Christmas Eve and parted warm and glowing. There had been a hard frost and a little snow. The sky was a colourless grey. Icicles hung from the arms of the street lamps, and the pavements were patterned out with frond-like forms that were trodden into slides as the day grew older. The Thames, they knew, was a wonderful sight, but that they kept until last. They went first along the Brompton Road. And it is well that you should have the picture of them right. Lewisham in the ready-made overcoat, blue cloth and velvet collar, dirty tan gloves, red tie and bowler hat, and Ethel in a 2-year-old jacket and hat of curly astrakhan, both pink-cheeked from the keen air, shyly arm in arm occasionally, and very alert to miss no possible spectacle. The shops were varied and interesting along the Brompton Road, but nothing to compare with Piccadilly. There were windows in Piccadilly so full of costly little things, it took 15 minutes to get them done. Card shops, drapers' shops, full of foolish, entertaining attractions. Lewisham, in spite of his old animosities, forgot to be severe on the shopping class. Ethel was so vastly entertained by all these pretty follies. Then up Regent Street by the place where the sham diamonds are, and the place where the girls display their long hair, and the place where the little chickens run about in the window, and so into Oxford Street, Holborn, Ludgate Hill, St. Paul's Churchyard, and Leadenhall, and the markets where turkeys, geese, ducklings, and chickens, turkeys predominant, however, hang in rows of 1,000 at a time. "I must buy you something," said Lewisham, resuming a topic. "No, no," said Ethel, with her eye down a vista of innumerable birds. "But I must," said Lewisham. "You had better choose it, or I shall get something wrong." His mind ran on brooches and clasps. "You mustn't waste your money, and besides, I have that ring." But Lewisham insisted. "Then if you must, I am starving. Buy me something to eat." An immense and memorable joke, Lewisham plunged recklessly, orientally, into an awe-inspiring place with mitred napkins. They lunched on cutlets, stripped the cutlets to the bone and little crisp brown potatoes, and they drank between them a whole half bottle of some white wine and other. Lewisham selected in an offhand way from the list. Neither of them had ever taken wine at a meal before. It was really very passable, Capri, a manufactured product, no doubt, but warming and aromatic. Ethel was aghast at his magnificence and drank a glass and a half. Then, very warm and comfortable, they went down by the tower, and the tower bridge with its crest of snow, huge pendant icicles, and the ice blocks choked in its side arches, was seasonable seeing. And as they had had enough of shops and crowds, they set off resolutely along the desolate embankment homeward. But indeed, the Thames was a wonderful sight that year, ice fringed along either shore, and with drift ice in the middle reflecting a luminous scarlet from the broad red setting sun and moving steadily, incessantly seaward. A swarm of mewing gulls went to and fro, and with them mingled pigeons and crows. The buildings on the Surrey side were dim and grey and very mysterious, the moored, ice-blocked barges silent and deserted, and here and there a lit window shone warm. The sun sank right out of sight into a bank of blue, and the Surrey side dissolved in mist, save for a few insoluble spots of yellow light that presently became many. And after our lovers had come under Charing Cross Bridge, the Houses of Parliament rose before them at the end of a great crescent of golden lamps, blue and faint, halfway between the earth and sky, and the clock on the tower was like a November sun. It was a day without a flaw, or at most but the slightest speck, and that only came at the very end. "Goodbye, dear," she said. "I have been very happy today." His face came very close to hers. "Goodbye," he said, pressing her hand and looking into her eyes. She glanced round. She drew nearer to him. "Dearest one," she whispered very softly, and then, "Goodbye." Suddenly he became unaccountably petulant. He dropped her hand. "It's always like this. We are happy. I am happy, and then you are taken away." There was a silence of mute interrogations. "Dear," she whispered, "we must wait." A moment's pause. "Wait," he said, and broke off. He hesitated. "Goodbye," he said, as though he was snapping a thread that held them together. Chapter 16. Miss Haydinger's Private Thoughts. The way from Chelsea to Clapham, and the way from South Kensington to Battersea, especially if the former is looped about a little to make it longer, come very near to each other. One night, close upon Christmas, two friends of Lewisham's passed him and Ethel, but Lewisham did not see them because he was looking at Ethel's face. "Did you see?" said the other girl, a little maliciously. "Mr. Lewisham, wasn't it?" said Miss Haydinger in a perfectly indifferent tone. Miss Haydinger sat in the room. Her younger sisters called her sanctum. Her sanctum was only too evidently an intellectualized bedroom, and the cheap wallpaper of silvery roses peeped coquettishly from among her draped furniture. Her particular glories were the writing desk in the middle and the microscope on the unsteady octagonal table under the window. There were bookshelves of workmanship patently feminine in their facile decoration and structural instability, and on them an array of glittering poets, Shelley, Rossetti, Keats, Browning, and odd volumes of Ruskin, South Place sermons, socialistic publications in torn paper covers, and above, science textbooks and notebooks in an oppressive abundance. The autotypes that hung about the room were eloquent of aesthetic ambitions and of a certain impermeability to implicit meanings. There were the Mirrors of Venus by Burne-Jones, Rossetti's Annunciation, Lippy's Annunciation, and The Love of Life and Love of Death of Watts. And among other photographs was one of last year's Debating Society committee, Lewisham smiling a little weakly near the centre, and Miss Haydinger out of focus in the right wing. And Miss Haydinger sat with her back to all these things, in her black horsehair armchair, staring into the fire, her eyes hot and her chin on her hand. "I might have guessed before," she said. "Ever since that séance, it has been different." She smiled bitterly. "Some shop girl," she mused. "They are all alike, I suppose. They come back a little damaged, as the woman says in Lady Windermere's Fan. Perhaps he will, I wonder. Why should he be so deceitful? Why should he act to me? Pretty, pretty, pretty. That is our business. What man hesitates in the choice? He goes his own way, thinks his own thoughts, does his own work. His dissection is getting behind. One can see he takes scarcely any notes." For a long time she was silent. Her face became more intent. She began to bite her thumb, at first slowly, then faster, then faster. She broke out at last into words again. The things he might do, the great things he might do. He is able, he is dogged, he is strong. And then comes a pretty face. Oh God, why was I made with heart and brain? She sprang to her feet, and her hands clenched and her face contorted, but she shed no tears. Her attitude fell limp in a moment. One hand dropped by her side, the other rested on a fossil on the mantel shelf, and she stared down into the red fire. To think of all we might have done, it maddens me. To work and think and learn, to hope and wait, to despise the petty arts of womanliness, to trust to the sanity of man, to awake like foolish virgins, she said, and find the hour of life is past. Her face, her pose softened into self-pity. Futility. It's no good. Her voice broke. I shall never be happy. She saw the grandiose vision of the future she had cherished suddenly rolled aside and vanishing, more and more splendid as it grew more and more remote, like a dream at the waking moment. The vision of her inevitable loneliness came to replace it, clear and acute. She saw herself alone and small in a huge desolation, infinitely pitiful. Lewisham callously receded with some shop girl. The tears came faster until they were streaming down her face. She turned as if looking for something. She flung herself upon her knees before the little armchair and began an incoherent sobbing prayer for the pity and comfort of God. The next day, one of the other girls in the biological course remarked to her friend that Haydinger dingery had relapsed. Her friend glanced down the laboratory. It's a bad relapse, she said. Really, I couldn't wear my hair like that. She continued to regard Miss Haydinger with a critical eye. She was free to do this because Miss Haydinger was standing, lost in thought, staring at the December fog outside the laboratory windows. She looks white, said the girl who had originally spoken. I wonder if she works hard. It makes precious little difference if she does, said her friend. I asked her yesterday what were the bones in the parietal segment, and she didn't know one, not one. The next day, Miss Haydinger's place was vacant. She was ill from overstudy, and her illness lasted to within 3 weeks of the terminal examination. Then she came back with a pallid face and a strenuous, unavailing industry. Chapter 17. In the Rafael Gallery. It was nearly 3 o'clock, and in the biological laboratory the lamps were all alight. The class was busy with razors cutting sections of the root of a fern to examine it microscopically. A certain silent frog-like boy, a private student who plays no further part in this story, was working intently, looking more like a frog than usual, his expression modest with a touch of effort. Behind Miss Haydinger, jaded and untidy in her early manner again, was a vacant seat, an abandoned microscope, and scattered pencils and notebooks. On the door of the classroom was a list of those who had passed the Christmas examination. At the head of it was the name of the aforesaid frog-like boy. Next to him came Smithers, and one of the girls bracketed together. Lewisham ingloriously headed the second class, and Miss Haydinger's name did not appear. There was, the list asserted, one failure. So the student pays for the finer emotions. And in the spacious solitude of the museum gallery devoted to the Rafael cartoons sat Lewisham, plunged in gloomy meditation. A negligent hand pulled thoughtfully at the indisputable moustache, with particular attention to such portions as were long enough to gnaw. He was trying to see the situation clearly, as he was just smarting acutely under his defeat. This speaks little for the clearness of his mind. The shadow of that defeat lay across everything, blotted out the light of his pride, shaded his honour, threw everything into a new perspective. The rich prettiness of his lovemaking had fled to some remote quarter of his being. Against the frog-like youngster he felt a savage animosity, and Smithers had betrayed him. He was angry, bitterly angry, with swats and muggers who spent their whole time grinding for these foolish, chancy examinations. Nor had the practical examination been altogether fair, and one of the questions in the written portion was quite outside the lectures. Professor Biver, was an indiscriminating ass, he felt assured, and so too was Weeks, the demonstrator. But these obstacles could not blind his intelligence to the manifest cause of his overthrow. The waste of more than half his available evening, the best time for study in the 24 hours, day after day. And that was going on steadily, a perpetual leakage of time. Tonight he would go to meet her again and begin to accumulate to himself ignominy in the second part of the course, the botanical section also. And so reluctantly rejecting one cloudy excuse after another, he clearly focused the antagonism between his relations to Ethel and his immediate ambitions. Things had come up so easily to him for the last 2 years that he had taken his steady upward progress in life as assured. It had never occurred to him when he went to intercept Ethel after that séance that he went into any peril of that sort. Now he had had a sharp reminder. He began to shape a picture of the frog-like boy at home. He was a private student of the upper middle class, sitting in a convenient study with a writing table, bookshelves, and a shaded lamp. Lewisham worked at his chest of drawers with his great coat on, and his feet in the lowest drawer, wrapped in all his available linen, and in the midst of incredible conveniences, the frog-like boy was working. Meanwhile, Lewisham toiled through the foggy streets, Chelseaward, or, after he had left her, tramped homeward, full of foolish imaginings. He began to think with bloodless lucidity of his entire relationship to Ethel. His softer emotions were in abeyance, but he told himself no lies. He cared for her. He loved to be with her and to talk to her and please her, and that was not all his desire. He thought of the bitter words of an orator at Hammersmith, who had complained that in our present civilization, even the elemental need of marriage was denied. Virtue had become a vice. We marry in fear and trembling. Sex for a home is the woman's traffic, and the man comes to his heart's desire when his heart's desire is dead. The thing which has seemed a mere flourish came back now with a terrible air of truth. Lewisham saw that it was a case of divergent ways. On the one hand, that shining staircase to fame and power that had been his dream from the very dawn of his adolescence, and on the other hand, Ethel. And if he chose Ethel, even then, would he have his choice? What would come of it? A few walks more or less. She was hopelessly poor, he was hopelessly poor, and this cheat of a medium was her stepfather. After all, she was not well educated. She did not understand his work and his aims. He suddenly perceived with absolute conviction that after the séance he should have gone home and forgotten her. Why had he felt that irresistible impulse to seek her out? Why had his imagination spun such a strange web of possibilities about her? He was involved now, foolishly involved. All his future was a sacrifice to this transitory ghost of lovemaking in the streets. He pulled spitefully at his moustache. His picture began to shape itself into Ethel, and her mysterious mother, and the vague, dexterous Chaffrey holding him back, entangled in an impalpable net, from that bright and glorious ascent to performance and distinction. Leaky boots and the splash of cabs for all his life as his portion. Already the Forbes medal, the immediate step, was as good as lost. What on earth had he been thinking about? He fell foul on his upbringing. Men of the upper or middle classes were put up to these things by their parents. They were properly warned against involving themselves in this love nonsense before they were independent. It was much better. Everything was going, not only his work, his scientific career, but the debating society, the political movement, all his work for humanity. Why not be resolute even now? Why not put the thing clearly and plainly to her, or write? If he wrote now, he could get the advantage of the evening at the library. He must ask her to forego these walks home, at least until the next examination. She would understand. He had a qualm of doubt whether she would understand. He grew angry at this possibility, but it was no good mincing matters. If once he began to consider her, why should he consider her in that way? Simply because she was unreasonable. Lewisham had a transitory gust of anger, yet that abandonment of the walks insisted on looking mean to him. And she would think it mean, which was very much worse somehow. Why mean? Why should she think it mean? He grew angry again. The portly museum policeman who had been watching him furtively, wondering why students should sit in front of the Sacrifice of Lystra and gnaw lips and nails and moustache, and scowl and glare at that masterpiece, saw him rise suddenly to his feet with an air of resolution, spin on his heel, and set off with a quick step out of the gallery. He looked neither to the right nor the left. He passed out of sight down the staircase. "Gone to get some more moustache to eat, I suppose," said the policeman reflectively. One would think something had bit him. After some pensive moments, the policeman strolled along down the gallery and came to a stop opposite the cartoon. "Figures is a bit big for the houses," said the policeman, anxious to do impartial justice. "But that's art. I lay he couldn't do anything, not half so good." Chapter 18. The Friends of Progress Meet. The night next but one after this meditation saw a new order in the world. A young lady dressed in an astrakhan-edged jacket and with a face of diminished cheerfulness marched from Chelsea to Clapham alone, and Lewisham sat in the flickering electric light of the education library, staring blankly at a business-like pile of books, at unseen things. The arrangement had not been effected without friction. The explanation had proved difficult. Evidently she did not appreciate the full seriousness of Lewisham's mediocre position in the list. "But you have passed all right," she said. Neither could she grasp the importance of evening study. "Of course, I don't know," she said judicially, "but I thought you were learning all day." She calculated the time consumed by their walk as half an hour. Just 1/2 hour. She forgot that he had to get to Chelsea and then to return to his lodgings. Her customary tenderness was veiled by an only too apparent resentment. First at him, and then, when he protested, at fate. "I suppose it has to be," she said. "Of course, it doesn't matter. I suppose if we don't see each other quite so often," with a quiver of pale lips. He had returned from the parting with an uneasy mind, and that evening had gone in the composition of a letter that was to make things clearer. But his scientific studies rendered his prose style hard, and things he could whisper he could not write. His justification, indeed, did him no sort of justice, but her reception of it made her seem a very unreasonable person. He had some violent fluctuations. At times he was bitterly angry with her for her failure to see things as he did. He would rather wander about the museum, conducting imaginary discussions with her and making even scathing remarks. At other times, he had to summon all his powers of arid discipline and all his memories of her resentful efforts to keep himself from a headlong rush to Chelsea and unmanly capitulation. And this new disposition of things endured for 2 weeks. It did not take Miss Haydinger all that time to discover that the disaster of the examination had wrought a change in Lewisham. She perceived those nightly walks were over. It was speedily evident to her that he was working with a kind of dogged fury. He came early, he went late. The wholesome freshness of his cheek paled. He was to be seen on each of the late nights amidst a pile of diagrams and textbooks in one of the less drafty corners of the educational library, accumulating piles of memoranda. And nightly in the Students' Club he wrote a letter addressed to a stationer's shop in Clapham, but that she did not see. For the most part, these letters were brief, for Lewisham, South Kensington fashion, prided himself upon not being literary, and some of the more dispatch-like wounded a heart perhaps too hungry for tender words. He did not meet Miss Haydinger's renewed advances with invariable kindness, yet something of the old relations were presently restored. He would talk well to her for a time, and then snap like a dry twig. But the loaning of books was resumed, the subtle process of his aesthetic education that Miss Haydinger had devised. "Here is a book I promised you," she said one day, and he tried to remember the promise. The book was a collection of Browning's poems, and it contained Sludge. It also happened that it contained the statue of the bust, that stimulating lecture of half-hearted constraints. Sludge did not interest Lewisham. It was not at all his idea of a medium, but he read and reread the statue and the bust. It had the profoundest effect upon him. He went to sleep. He used to read his literature in bed because it was warmer there, and over literature nowadays it did not matter, as it did with science, if one dozed a little, with these lines stimulating his emotion. So weeks grew months, years, gleam by gleam, the glory dropped from their youth and love, and both perceived they had dreamed a dream. By way of fruit it may be to such seed, he dreamed a dream that night. It concerned Ethel, and at last they were a-marrying. He drew her to his arms, he bent to kiss her, and suddenly he saw her lips were shriveled, and her eyes were dull, saw the wrinkles seaming her face. She was old, she was intolerably old. He woke in a kind of horror, and lay awake and very dismal until dawn, thinking of their separation and of her solitary walk through the muddy streets, thinking of his position, the leeway he had lost and the chances there were against him in the battle of the world. He perceived the colourless truth, the career was improbable, and that Ethel should be added to it was almost hopeless. Clearly the question was between these two, or should he vacillate and lose both? And then his wretchedness gave place to that anger that comes of perpetually thwarted desires. It was on the day after this dream that he insulted Parkson so grossly. He insulted Parkson after a meeting of the Friends of Progress in Parkson's rooms. No type of English student quite realizes the noble ideal of plain living and high thinking nowadays. Our admirable examination system admits of extremely little thinking at any level, high or low, but the Kensington student's living is at any rate insufficient, and he makes occasional signs of recognition towards the cosmic process. One such sign was the periodic gathering of these Friends of Progress, an association begotten of Lewisham's paper on socialism. It was understood that strenuous things were to be done to make the world better, but so far no decisive action had been taken. They met in Parkson's sitting room, because Parkson was the only one of the Friends opulent enough to have a sitting room, he being a Whitworth scholar, and in receipt of £100 a year. The Friends were of various ages, most very young. Several smoked, and others held pipes, which they had discontinued smoking, but there was nothing to drink except coffee, because that was the extent of their means. Dunkerley, an assistant master in a suburban school, and Lewisham's former college at Waterley, attended these assemblies through the introduction of Lewisham. All the Friends wore red ties except Bletherley, who wore an orange one to show that he was aware of art, and Dunkley, who wore a black one with blue specs because assistant masters in small private schools have to keep up appearances, and their simple procedure was that each talked as much as the other would suffer. Usually the self-proposed Luther of socialism, ridiculous Lewisham, had a thesis or so to maintain, but this night he was depressed and inattentive. He sat with his legs over the arms of his chair by way of indicating the state of his mind. He had a packet of Algerian cigarettes, 20 for 5p, and appeared chiefly concerned to smoke them all before the evening was out. Bletherley was going to discourse of woman under socialism, and he brought a big American edition of Shelley's works and a volume of Tennyson with the Princess, both bristling with paper tongues against his marked questions. He was all for the abolition of monopolies, and the creche was to replace the family. He was unctuous when he was not pretty, and his views were evidently unpopular. Parkson was a man from Lancashire and a devout Quaker. His third and completing factor was Ruskin, with whose work and phraseology he was saturated. He listened to Bletherley with a marked disapproval and opened a vigorous defence of that ancient tradition of loyalty that Bletherley had called the monopolist institution of marriage. The pure and simple old theory, love and faithfulness, said Parkson, suffices for me, if we are to smear our political movements with this sort of stuff. Does it work? Interjected Lewisham, speaking for the first time. What work? The pure and simple old theory. I know the theory, I believe in the theory. Bletherley's Shelley witted. But it's not theory. You meet the inevitable girl. The theory says you may never meet her anyway. You meet too young, you fall in love. You marry in spite of obstacles. Love laughs at locksmiths. You have children. That's the theory. All very well for a man whose father can leave him 500 a year. But how does it work for a shopman, an assistant master like Dunkley or me? In these cases, one must exercise restraint, said Parkson. Have faith. A man that is worth having is worth waiting for. Worth growing old for, said Lewisham. Chap ought to fight, said Dunkley. Don't you see difficulty, Lewisham? Struggle for existence, keen, no doubt, tremendous in fact, still. In it, may as well struggle. Two joined forces, pool the luck. If I saw a girl I fancied so that I wanted to, I'd marry her tomorrow. And my market value is 70 none less. Lewisham looked round at him eagerly, suddenly interested. Would you? He said. Dunkley's face was slightly flushed. Like a shot. Why not? But how are you to live? That comes after if. I can't agree with you, Mr. Dunkley, said Parkson. I don't know if you have read Sesame and Lilies, but there you have set forth far more fairly than any words of mine could do, an ideal of a woman's place. All rot, Sesame and Lilies, interrupted Dunkley. Read bits. Couldn't stand it. Never can stand Ruskin. Too many prepositions. Tremendous English, no doubt, but not my style. Sort of thing a wholesale grocer's daughter might read to get refined. We can't afford to get refined. But would you really marry a girl? Began Lewisham with an unprecedented admiration for Dunkley in his eyes. Why not? On, Lewisham hesitated. £40 a year, rests whack. Yes. A silent youngster began to speak, cleared an accumulated huskiness from his throat, and said, Consider the girl. Why marry? Asked Bletherley, unregarded. You must admit you are asking a great thing when you want a girl, began Parkson. Not so. When the girl's chosen a man, and he chooses her, her place is with him. What is the good of hankering? Mutual. Fight together. Good, said Lewisham, suddenly emotional. You talk like a man. Dunkley, I'm hanged if you don't. The place of woman, insisted Parkson, is the home, and if there is no home, I hold that if need be, a man should toil 7 years, as Jacob did for Rachel, ruling his passions to make the home fitting and sweet for her. Gets the hutch for the pet animal, said Dunkley. No, I mean to marry a woman. Female sex always has been the struggle for existence. No great damage so far, will always be. Tremendous idea that struggle for existence. All sensible theory you've got hold of, Lewisham. Woman who isn't fighting square side by side with a man, woman who's just keeping and fed and petted is... He hesitated. A lad with a spotted face and a bulldog pipe between his teeth supplied a biblical word. That's shag, said Dunkley. I was going to say a harem one. The youngster was puzzled for a moment. I spoke perique, he said. It will make you just as sick, said Dunkley. Refinement so beastly vulgar, was the belated answer of the smoker of perique. That was the interesting part of the evening to Lewisham. Parkson suddenly rose, got down Sesame and Lilies, and insisted upon reading a lengthy, mellifluous extract that went like a garden roller over the debate, and afterwards Bletherley became the centre of a wrangle that left him grossly insulted and in the minority of one. The institution of marriage, so far as the South Kensington student is concerned, is in no immediate danger. Parkson turned out with the rest of them at 10:30 for a walk. The night was warm for February and the waxing moon bright. Parkson fixed himself upon Lewisham and Dunkley, to Lewisham's intense annoyance, for he had a few intimate things he could have said to the man of ideas that night. Dunkley lived north, so that the three went up Exhibition Road to High Street, Kensington. There they departed from Dunkley, and Lewisham and Parkson turned southward again for Lewisham's new lodging in Chelsea. Parkson was one of those exponents of virtue for whom the discussion of sexual matters had an irresistible attraction. The meeting had left him eloquent. He had argued with Dunkley to the verge of indelicacy, and now he poured out a vast and increasingly confidential flow of talk upon Lewisham. Lewisham was distraught. He walked as fast as he could. His sole object was to get rid of Parkson. Parkson's sole object was to tell him interesting secrets about himself and a certain person with a mind of extraordinary purity of whom Lewisham had heard before. Ages passed. Lewisham suddenly found himself being shown a photograph under a lamp. It represented an unsymmetrical face singularly void of expression, the upper part of an art dress and a fringe of curls. He perceived he was being given to understand that this was a paragon of purity, and that she was the particular property of Parkson. Parkson was regarding him proudly, and apparently awaiting his verdict. Lewisham struggled with the truth. It's an interesting face, he said. It is a face essentially beautiful, said Parkson, quietly but firmly. Do you notice the eyes, Lewisham? Oh yes, said Lewisham. Yes, I see the eyes. They are innocent. They are the eyes of a little child. Yes. They look that sort of eye. Very nice, old man. I congratulate you. Where does she live? You never saw a face like that in London, said Parkson. Never, said Lewisham, decisively. I would not show that to everyone, said Parkson. You can scarcely judge all that pure-hearted, wonderful girl is to me. He returned the photograph solemnly to its envelope, regarding Lewisham with an air of one who has performed the ceremony of blood brotherhood. Then, taking Lewisham's arm affectionately, a thing Lewisham detested, he went on to a copious outpouring on love, with illustrative anecdotes of the paragon. It was just sufficiently cognate to the matter of Lewisham's thoughts to demand attention. Every now and then he had to answer, and he felt an idiotic desire, albeit he clearly perceived its idiocy, to reciprocate confidences. The necessity of fleeing Parkson became urgent. Lewisham's temper under these multitudinous stresses was going. Every man needs a lodestar, said Parkson, and Lewisham swore under his breath. Parkson's lodgings were now near at hand to the left, and it occurred to him this boredom would be soon ascended if he took Parkson home. Parkson consented mechanically, still discoursing. I have often seen you talking to Miss Haydinger, he said, if you will pardon my saying it. We are excellent friends, admitted Lewisham, but here we are at your diggings. Parkson started at his diggings. There's heaps I want to talk about. I'll come part of the way, at any rate, to Battersea. You're Miss Haydinger, I was saying. From that point onwards, he made a casual appeal to a supposed confidence between Lewisham and Miss Haydinger. each of which increased Lewisham's exasperation. It will not be long before you also, Lewisham, will begin to know the infinite purification of a pure love. Then suddenly, with a vague idea of suppressing Parkson's unendurable chatter as one motive at least, Lewisham rushed into the confidential. I know, he said, you talk to me as though I've marked out my destiny these 3 years. His confidential impulse died as he relived it. You don't mean to say, Miss Haydinger? Asked Parkson. Oh, damn, Miss Haydinger, said Lewisham, and suddenly, abruptly, uncivilly, he turned away from Parkson at the end of the street and began walking away southward, leaving Parkson in mid-sentence at the crossing. Parkson stared in astonishment at his receding back and ran after him to ask for the grounds of this sudden offence. Lewisham walked on for a space with Parkson trotting by his side. Then suddenly he turned. His face was quite white and he spoke in a tired voice. Parkson, he said, you are a fool. You have the face of a sheep, the manners of a buffalo, and the conversation of a boor. The girl whose photograph you showed me has eyes that don't match. She looks as loathsome as one would naturally expect. I'm not joking now. Go away. After that, Lewisham went on his southward way alone. He did not go straight to his room in Chelsea, but spent some hours in the streets in Battersea, pacing to and fro in a possible house. His passion changed from savageness to a tender lodging. If only he could see her tonight. He knew his own mind now. Tomorrow, he was resolved, he would fling work to the dogs to meet her. The things Dunkerley had said had filled his mind with wonderful novel of thoughts. If only he could see her now. His wish was granted. At the corner of the street, 2 figures passed him, one of these a tall man in glasses and a quasi-clerical hat, with coat collar turned up under his grey side whiskers, he recognized as Chaffrey. The other he knew only too well. The pair passed him without seeing him, but for an instant the lamplight fell upon her face and showed it white and tired. Lewisham stopped dead at the corner, staring at blank astonishment after these 2 figures as they receded into the haze under the lights. He was dumbfounded. A clock struck slowly. It was midnight. Presently down the road came the slamming of the door. Long after the echo died away, he stood there. She has been at a séance. She has broken her promise, sang in perpetual reiteration through his brain. And then came the interpretation. She has done it because I have left her. I might have told it from her letters. She has done it because she thinks I am not in earnest, that my love-making was just boyish. I knew she would never understand. Chapter 19. Lewisham's Solution. The next morning, Lewisham learnt from Lagoon that his intuition was correct, that Ethel had at last succumbed to pressure and consented to attempt thought-reading. We made a good beginning, said Lagoon, rubbing his hands. I am sure we shall do well with her. Certainly she has powers. I have always felt it in her face. She has powers. Was much pressure necessary? Asked Lewisham by an effort. We had considerable difficulty, but of course, as I pointed out to her, it was scarcely possible for her to continue as my typewriter unless she was disposed to take an interest in my investigations. You did that? Had to. Fortunately, Chaffrey, it was his idea, I must admit. Lagoon stopped astonished. Lewisham, after making an odd sort of movement with his hands, had turned round and was walking away down the laboratory. Lagoon stared, confronted by a psychic phenomenon beyond his circle of ideas. Odd, he said at last, and began to unpack his bag. Ever and again he stopped and stared at Lewisham, who was now sitting in his own place and drumming on the table with both hands. Presently Miss Haydinger came out of the specimen room and addressed a remark to a young man. He appeared to answer with considerable brevity. He then stood up, hesitated for a moment between the 3 doors of the laboratory, and walked out by that opening on the back staircase. Lagoon did not see him again until the afternoon. That night Ethel had Lewisham's company again on her way home, and their voices were earnest. She did not go straight home, but instead they went up under the gas lamps to the vague spaces of Clapham Common and talked there again. And the talk that night was a momentous one. "Why have you broken your promise?" he said. Her excuses were vague and weak. "I thought you did not care so much as you did," she said. "And when you stopped these walks, nothing seemed to matter. Besides, it is not like seances with spirits." At first, Lewisham was passionate and forcible. His anger at Lagoon and Chaffrey blinded him to her turpitude. He talked her defences down. "It's cheating," he said. "Well, even if what you do is not cheating, it is delusion, unconscious cheating. Even if there is something in it, it's wrong. True or not, it is wrong. Why don't they thought read each other? Why should they want you? Your mind is your own. It is sacred to probe it. I won't have it. I won't have it. At least you are mine to that extent. I can't think of you like that, bandaged. And that little fool pressing his hand on the back of your neck and asking questions. I won't have it. I would rather kill you than that. They don't do that. I don't care. That is what it will come to. The bandage is the beginning. People must not get their living in that way anyhow. I've thought it out. Let them thought read their daughters and hypnotize their aunts and leave their typewriters alone. But what am I to do? That's not it. There are things one must not suffer anyhow, whatever happens, or else one might be made to do anything. Honour, just because we are poor, let him dismiss you. You can get another place. Not at a guinea a week. Then take less. But I have to pay 16 shillings every week. That doesn't matter." She caught at a sob. "But to leave London, I can't do it. I can't." "But how? Leave London?" Lewisham's face changed. "Oh, life is hard," she said. "I can't. They wouldn't let me stop in London." "What do you mean?" She explained if Lagoon dismissed her, she was to go into the country to an aunt, a sister of Chaffrey, who needed a companion. Chaffrey insisted upon that. "Companion, they call it. I shall be just a servant." "She has no servant." "My mother cries when I talk to her. She tells me she doesn't want me to go away from her, but she's afraid of him. 'Why don't you do what he wants?' she says." She sat staring in front of her at the gathering night. She spoke again in an even tone. "I hate telling you these things. It is you, if you didn't mind, but you make it all different. I could do it if it wasn't for you. I was helping. I had gone meaning to help if anything went wrong at Mr. Lagoon's. Then that night, no, don't. It was too hard before to tell you, but I really did not feel it until I saw you there. Then all at once I felt shabby and mean." "Well," said Lewisham, "that's all. I may have done thought reading, but I have never really cheated since, never. If you knew how hard it is. I wish you had told me that before." "I couldn't. Before you came, it was different. He used to make fun of the people, used to imitate Lagoon and make me laugh. It seemed a sort of joke." She stopped abruptly. "Why did you ever come on with me?" "I told you not to. You know I did." She was near wailing. For a minute she was silent. "I can't go to his sister's," she cried. "I may be a coward, but I can't." Pause. And then Lewisham saw his solution straight and clear. Suddenly, his secret desire had become his manifest duty. "Look here," he said, not looking at her and pulling his moustache. "I won't have you doing any more of that damned cheating. You shan't soil yourself any more. And I won't have you leaving London." "But what am I to do?" Her voice went up. "Well, there is one thing you can do if you dare." "What is it?" He made no answer for some seconds. Then he turned round and sat looking at her. Their eyes met. The grey of his mind began to colour. Her face was white and she was looking at him in fear and perplexity. A new tenderness for her sprang up in him, a new feeling. Hitherto he had loved and desired her sweetness and animation, but now she was white and weary-eyed. He felt as though he had forgotten her and suddenly remembered. A great longing came into his mind. "But what is the other thing I can do?" It was strangely hard to say. There came a peculiar sensation in his throat and facial muscles, a nervous stress between laughing and crying. All the world vanished before that great desire, and he was afraid she would not dare, that she would not take him seriously. What is it? She said again. Don't you see that we can marry? He said, with the flood of his resolution suddenly strong and steady. Don't you see that it is the only thing for us? The dead lane we are in. You must come out of your cheating, and I must come out of my cramming, and we must marry. He paused and then became eloquent. The world is against us, against us. To you it offers money to cheat, to be ignoble, for it is ignoble. It offers you no honest way, only a miserable drudgery, and it keeps you from me, and me too it bribes with the promise of success. If I will desert you, you don't know all. We may have to wait for years, we may have to wait forever. If we wait until life is safe, we may be separated, we may lose one another altogether. Let us fight against it. Why should we separate? Unless true love is like the other things, an empty can't. This is the only way, we two who belong to one another. She looked at him, her face perplexed with this new idea, her heart beating very fast. We are so young, she said, and how are we to live? You get a guinea. I can get more, I can earn more. I have thought it out. I have been thinking of it these 2 days. I have been thinking what we could do. I have money. You have money? Nearly £100. But we are so young, and my mother, we won't ask her, we will ask no one. This is our affair. Ethel, this is our affair. It is not a question of ways and means. Even before this, I have thought, dear one, don't you love me? She did not grasp his emotional quality. She looked at him with puzzled eyes, still practical, making the suggestion arithmetical. I could typewrite if I had a machine, I have heard. It's not a question of ways and means. Now, Ethel, I have longed. He stopped. She looked at his face, and his eyes now eager and eloquent with things that never shaped themselves into words. Dare you come with me? He whispered. Suddenly the world opened out in reality to her as sometimes it had opened out to her in wistful dreams, and she quailed before it. She dropped her eyes from his. She became a fellow conspirator, but how? I will think of how, trust me, surely we know each other now. Think, we two, but I have never thought. I could get apartments for us both. It would be so easy. And think of it, think of what life would be. How can I? You will come? She looked at him, startled. You know, she said, you must know I would love. You will come. But dear, if you make me. Yes, cried Lewisham triumphantly, you will come. He glanced round and his voice dropped. Oh, my dearest, my dearest. His voice sank in an inaudible whisper, but his face was eloquent. Two garrulous, home-going clerks passed opportunely to remind him that his emotions were in a public place. Chapter 20. The career is suspended. On the Wednesday afternoon following this, it was hard upon the botanical examination. Mr. Lewisham was observed by Smithers in the big education library, reading in the volume of the British Encyclopedia. Beside him were the current Whitaker's Almanac, an open notebook, a book from the Contemporary Science series, and the Science and Art Department's directory. Smithers, who had a profound sense of Lewisham's superiority in the art of obtaining facts of value in examinations, wondered for some minutes what valuable tip for student in botany might be hidden in Whitaker, and on reaching his lodgings spent some time over the landlady's copy. But really Lewisham was not studying botany, but the art of marriage according to the best authorities. The book from the Contemporary Science series was Professor Lettoneux's Evolution of Marriage. It was interesting certainly, but of little immediate use. From Whitaker, Lewisham learnt that it would be possible at the cost of £2 to get married within the week, that charge being exclusive of veils at the district registry office. He did little addition sums in the notebook. The church fees he found were variable, but for more personal reasons he rejected a marriage at church. Marriage by certificate at a registrar's involved an inconvenient delay. It would have to be £2, veils 10 shillings, say. Afterwards, without needless ostentation, he produced a checkbook and a deposit book and proceeded to further arithmetic. He found that he was master of £61, not 100 as he had said, but a fine big sum. Men have started great businesses on less. It had been 100 originally. Allowing £5 for the marriage and moving, this would leave about £56. Plenty. No provision was made for flowers, carriages, or the honeymoon, but there would be a typewriter to buy. Ethel was to do her share. It will be a devilish close thing, said Lewisham, with a quite unreasonable exultation, for strangely enough the affair was beginning to take on a flavour of adventure, not at all unpleasant. He leant back in his chair with the notebook closed in his hand, but there was much to see to that afternoon. First of all, he had to discover the district superintendent registrar, and then to find a lodging whither he should take Ethel, their lodging, where they were to live together. At the thought of that new life together was drawing so near. She came into his head, vivid and near and warm. He recovered himself from a daydream. He became aware of a library attendant down the room, leaning forward over his desk, gnawing the tip of a paper knife after the fashion of South Kensington library attendants, and staring at him curiously. It occurred to Lewisham that thought-reading was one of the most possible things in the world. He blushed, rose clumsily, and took the volume of the encyclopedia back to its shelf. He found the selection of lodgings a difficult business. After his first essay, he began to fancy himself a suspicious-looking character, and that perhaps hampered him. He had chosen the district southward of the Brompton Road. It had one disadvantage. He might blunder into a house with a fellow student. Not that it mattered vitally, but the fact is, it is rather unusual for married couples to live permanently in furnished lodgings in London. People who are too poor to take a house or a flat commonly find it best to take part of a house or unfurnished apartments. There are 100 couples living in unfurnished rooms to 1 in furnished in London. The absence of furniture predicates a dangerous want of capital to the discreet landlady. The first landlady Lewisham interviewed didn't like ladies. They required such a lot of attendance. The second was of the same mind. The third told Mr. Lewisham he was youngish to be married. The fourth said she only did for single gents. The fifth was a young person with an arch manner who liked to know all about people she took in and subjected Lewisham to a searching cross-examination. When she had spotted him in a downright lie or so, she expressed an opinion that her rooms would scarcely do and bowed him amiably out. He cooled his ears and cheeks by walking up and down the street for a space and then tried again. This landlady was a terrible and pitiful person. So grey and dusty she was, and her face deep lined with dust and trouble and labour. She wore a dirty cap that was all askew. She took Lewisham up into a threadbare room on the first floor. "There's the use of a piano," she said, and indicated an instrument with a front of torn green silk. Lewisham opened the keyboard and evoked a vibration of broken strings. He took one further survey of the dismal place. 18 shillings, he said. "Thank you, I'll let you know." The woman smiled and the corners of her mouth down, and without a word moved wearily towards the door. Lewisham felt a transient wonder at her hopeless position, but he did not pursue the inquiry. The next landlady sufficed. She was a clean-looking German woman, rather smartly dressed. She had a fringe of flaxen curls and a voluble flow of words, for the most part recognizably English. With this she sketched out remarks. 15 shillings was her demand for a minute bedroom and a small sitting room, separated by folding doors on the ground floor, and her personal services. Coals were to be 6p a kettle, she said, a pretty substitute for scuttle. She had not understood Lewisham to say he was married, but she had no hesitation. 18 shilling, she said imperturbably. Paid 4 days each week, see? Mr. Lewisham surveyed the rooms again. They looked clean, and the Venus tea vases, the rancid, gilt-framed oleographs, 2 toilet tidies, used as ornaments, and the fact that the chest of drawers had been crowded out of the bedroom into the sitting room simply appealed to his sense of humour. "I'll take them from Saturday next," he said. She was sure he would like them and proposed to give him his book forthwith. She mentioned casually that the previous lodger had been a captain and had stayed 3 years. One never hears by any chance of lodgers stopping for a shorter period. Something happened, and now he kept his carriage, apparently an outcome of his stay. She returned with a small penny account book, a bottle of ink, and an execrable pen. Wrote Lewisham's name on the cover of this, and a receipt for 18 shillings on the first page. She was evidently a person of considerable business aptitude. Lewisham paid, and the transaction terminated. Sure to be comfortable, followed him comfortingly to the street. Then he went on to Chelsea and interviewed a fatherly gentleman at the vestry offices. The fatherly gentleman was chubby-faced and spectacled, and his manner was sympathetic but businesslike. He called back each item of the interview. "And what can I do for you? You wish to be married? By license? By license? By license," and so forth. He opened a book and made neat entries of the particulars. The lady's age, 21, a very suitable age for a lady. He advised Lewisham to get a ring and said he would need 2 witnesses. "Well," hesitated Lewisham. "There is always someone about," said the superintendent registrar, "and they are quite used to it." Thursday and Friday Lewisham passed in exceedingly high spirits. No consciousness of the practical destruction of the career seems to have troubled him at this time. Doubt had vanished from his universe for a space. He wanted to dance along the corridors. He felt curiously irresponsible and threw up an unpleasant sort of humour that pleased nobody. He wished Miss Haydinger many happy returns of the day, apropos of nothing, and he threw a bun across the refreshment room at Smithers and hit one of the art school officials. Both were extremely silly little things to do. In the first instance, he was penitent immediately after the outrage, but in the second, he added insult to injury by going across the room and asking in an offensively suspicious manner if anyone had seen his bun. He crawled under a table and found it at last, rather dusty and quite eatable, under the chair of a lady art student. He sat down by Smithers to eat it. While he argued with the art official said the manners of the science students were getting unbearable, and threatened to bring the matter before the refreshment room committee. Lewisham said it was a pity to make such a fuss about a trivial thing, and proposed that the art official should throw his lunch, steak and kidney pudding, across the room at him, Lewisham, and so get immediate satisfaction. He then apologized to the official and pointed out in extenuation that it was a very long and difficult shot he had attempted. The official then drank a crumb or breathed some beer or something of that sort, and the discussion terminated. In the afternoon, however, Lewisham, to his undying honour, felt acutely ashamed of himself. Miss Haydinger would not speak to him. On Saturday morning, he absented himself from the schools, pleading by post a slight indisposition, and took all his earthly goods to the booking office at Vauxhall Station. Chaffrey's sister lived at Tongham, near Farnham, and Ethel, dismissed a week since by Lagoon, had started that morning, under her mother's maudlin supervision, to begin her new slavery. She was to alight either at Farnham or Woking, as opportunity arose, and to return to Vauxhall to meet him, so that Lewisham's vigil on the main platform was of indefinite duration. At first he felt the exhilaration of a great adventure. Then, as he paced the long platform, came a philosophical mood, a sense of entire detachment from the world. He saw a bundle of uprooted plants beside the portmanteau of a fellow passenger, and it suggested a grotesque simile. His roots, his earthly possessions, were all downstairs in the booking office. What a flimsy thing he was! A box of books and a trunk of clothes, some certificates and scraps of paper, an entry here and an entry there, a body not over-strong, and the vast multitude of people about him, against him, the huge world in which he found himself. Did it matter anything to one human soul save her if he ceased to exist forthwith? And miles away, perhaps she also was feeling little and lonely. Would she have trouble with her luggage? Suppose her aunt were to come to Farnham Junction to meet her. Suppose someone stole her purse. Suppose she came too late. The marriage was to take place at 2. Suppose she never came at all. After 3 trains in succession had disappointed him, his vague feelings of dread gave place to a profound depression. But she came at last, and it was 23 minutes to 2. He hurried her luggage downstairs, booked it with his own, and in another minute they were in a hansom, their first experience of that species of conveyance, on the way to the vestry office. They had said scarcely anything to one another, save hasty directions from Lewisham, but their eyes were full of excitement, and under the apron of the cab their hands were gripped together. The little old gentleman was businesslike but kindly. They made their vows to him, to a little black-bearded clerk and a lady who took off an apron in the nether part of the building to attend. The little old gentleman made no long speeches. "You are young people," he said slowly, "and life together is a difficult thing. Be kind to each other." He smiled a little sadly and held out a friendly hand. Ethel's eyes glistened, and she found she could not speak. Chapter 21. Home. Then a furtive payment of witnesses, and Lewisham was beside her. His face was radiant. A steady current of workers going home to their half-holiday rest poured along the street. On the steps before them lay a few grains of rice from some more public nuptials. A critical little girl eyed our couple curiously and made some remark to her ragamuffin friend. "Not them," said the ragamuffin friend. "They've only been asking questions." The ragamuffin friend was no judge of faces. They walked back through the thronged streets to Vauxhall Station, saying little to one another, and there Lewisham, assuming as indifferent a manner as he could command, recovered their possessions from the booking office by means of 2 separate tickets and put them aboard a 4-wheeler. His luggage went outside, but the little brown portmanteau containing Ethel's trousseau was small enough to go on the seat in front of them. You must figure a rather broken-down 4-wheeler bearing the yellow-painted box and the inexperienced trunk, and Mr. Lewisham and all his fortunes, a despondent, fitful horse, and a threadbare, venerable driver, blasphemous sotto voce, and flagellant, in an ancient coat with capes. When our 2 young people found themselves in the cab again, a certain stiffness of manner between them vanished, and there was more squeezing of hands. "Ethel, Lewisham," said Lewisham several times, and Ethel reciprocated with "husbander" and "hubby dear," and took off her glove to look again in an ostentatious manner at a ring, and she kissed the ring. They were resolved that their newly married state should not appear, and with considerable ceremony it was arranged that he should treat her with offhand brusqueness when they arrived at their lodging. The Teutonic lady appeared in the passage with an amiable smile and the hope that they had had a pleasant journey, and became voluble with promises of comfort. Lewisham, having assisted the slatternly general servant to carry in his boxes, paid the cabman a florin in a resolute manner, and followed the ladies into the sitting-room. Ethel answered Madame Gadow's inquiries with admirable self-possession, followed her through the folding doors, and displayed an intelligent interest in a new spring mattress. Presently the folding doors were closed again. Lewisham hovered about the front room, pulling his moustache and pretending to admire the oleographs, surprised to find himself trembling. The slatternly general servant reappeared with the chops and tinned salmon. He had asked Madame Gadow to prepare for them. He went and stared out of the window, heard the door close behind the girl, and turned at a sound as Ethel appeared shyly through the folding doors. She was suddenly domestic. Hitherto he had seen her without a hat and jacket, only on one indistinct dramatic occasion. Now she wore a little blouse of soft, dark red material with a white froth about the wrists and that pretty neck of hers, and her hair was a new wonderland of curls and soft strands. How delicate she looked and sweet as she stood, hesitating there. These gracious moments in life. He took 2 steps and held out his arms. She glanced at the closed door of the room and came flitting towards him. Chapter 22. Epithalamy. For 3 indelible days, Lewisham's existence was a fabric of fine emotions. Life was too wonderful and beautiful for any doubts or forethought. To be with Ethel was perpetual delight. She astonished this sisterless youngster with 1,000 feminine niceties and refinements. She shamed him for his strength and clumsiness, and the light in her eyes and the warmth of her heart that lit them. Even to be away from her was a wonder, and in its way delightful. He was no common student. He was a man with a secret life. To part from her on Monday near South Kensington Station and go up to Exhibition Road among all the fellows who lived in sordid, lonely lodgings and were boys to his day-old experience. To neglect one's work and sit back and dream of meeting again. To slip off to the shady churchyard behind the oratory when, or even a little before, the midday bell woke the great staircase to activity, and to meet a smiling face and hear a soft voice saying sweet, foolish things. And after 4, another meeting, and the walk home, their own home. No little form now went from him and flitted past the gas lamp down the foggy vista, taking his desire with her. Nevermore was that to be. Lewisham's long hours in the laboratory were spent largely in a dreamy meditation, in, to tell the truth, the invention of foolish terms of endearment. Dear wife, dear little wife thing, sweetest, dearest little wife, dillywings. A pretty employment, and these are quite a few fair specimens of his originality during these wonderful days. A moment of heart searching in that particular manner led to the discovery of hitherto undreamt of kindred with Swift. For Lewisham, like Swift and most other people, had hit upon the little language. Indeed, it was a very foolish time. Such section cutting as he did that 3rd day of his married life, and he did very little, was a thing to marvel at. Bindon, the botany professor, under the fresh shock of his performance, protested to a colleague in the grew room that never had a student been so foolishly overrated. And Ethel, too, had a fine emotional time. She was mistress of a home, their home together. She shopped and was called ma'am by a respectful, good-looking shopman. She designed meals and copied out papers of notes with a rich sense of helpfulness. And ever and again, she would stop writing and sit dreaming. And for 4 bright weekdays, she went to and fro to accompany and meet Lewisham and listen greedily to the latest fruits of his imagination. The landlady was very polite and conversed entertainingly about the very extraordinary and dissolute servants that had fallen to her lot. And Ethel disguised her newly wedded state by a series of ingenious prevarications. She wrote a letter that Saturday evening to her mother. Lewisham had helped her to write it, making a sort of proclamation of her heroic departure and promising a speedy visit. They posted the letter so that it might not be delivered until Monday. She was quite sure with Lewisham that only the possible dishonour of mediumship could have brought their marriage about. She sank the mutual attraction beyond even her own vision. There was more than a touch of magnificence, you perceive, about this affair. It was Lewisham had persuaded her to delay that reassuring visit until Monday night. 1 whole day of honeymoon, he insisted, was to be theirs. In his prenuptial meditations, he had not clearly focused the fact that even after their marriage, some sort of relations with Mr. and Mrs. Chaffrey would still go on. Even now he was exceedingly disinclined to face that obvious necessity. He foresaw, in spite of a resolute attempt to ignore it, that there would be explanatory scenes of some little difficulty, but the prevailing magnificence carried him over his trouble. "Let us at least have this little time for ourselves," he said, and that seemed to settle their position. Save for its brevity and these intimations of future trouble, it was a very fine time indeed. Their midday dinner together, for example, it was a little cold when they at last came to it on Saturday, was immense fun. There was no marked subsidence of appetite. They ate extremely well in spite of the meeting of their souls, and in spite of certain shiftings of chairs and hand claspings and similar delays. He really made the acquaintance of her hands then, for the first time, plump white hands with short white fingers, and the engagement ring had come out of its slender hiding place and acted as keeper to the wedding ring. Their eyes were perpetually flitting about the room and coming back to mutual smiles. All their movements were faintly tremulous. She professed to be vastly interested and amused by the room and its furniture and her position, and he was delighted by her delight. She was particularly entertained by the chest of drawers in the living room and by Lewisham's witticisms at the toilet tidies and the oleographs. And after the chops and the most of the tinned salmon and the very new loaf were gone, they fell to with fine effect upon a tapioca pudding. Their talk was fragmentary. "Did you hear her call me madam?" "Madam, so, and presently I must go out and do some shopping. There are all the things for Sunday and Monday morning to get. I must make a list. It will never do to let her know how little I know about things. I wish I knew more." At the time, Lewisham regarded her confession of domestic ignorance as a fine basis for facetiousness. He developed a fresh line of thought and condoled with her on the inglorious circumstances of their wedding. No bridesmaids, he said, no little children scattering flowers, no carriages, no policemen to guard the wedding presents. Nothing proper, nothing right. Not even a white favour. Only you and I. Only you and I. Oh, this is nonsense, said Lewisham after an interval. And think what we lose in the way of speeches, he resumed. Cannot you imagine the best man rising? Ladies and gentlemen, the health of the bride. That is what the best man has to do, isn't it? By way of an answer, she extended her hand. And do you know, he said, after that had received due recognition, we have never been introduced. Neither have we, said Ethel. Neither have we. We have never been introduced. For some inscrutable reason, it delighted them both enormously to think that they had never been introduced. In the later afternoon, Lewisham, having unpacked his books to a certain extent and so forth, was visible to all men, visibly in the highest spirits, carrying home Ethel's shopping. There were parcels and cones in blue and parcels in rough grey paper, and a bag of confectionery, and out of one of the side pockets of that East End overcoat, the tail of a haddock protruded from its paper. Under such magnificent sanctions and amid such ignoble circumstances did this honeymoon begin. On Sunday evening, they went for a long, rambling walk through the quiet streets, coming out at last into Hyde Park. The early spring night was mild and clear, and the kindly moonlight was about them. They went to the bridge and looked down the Serpentine, with the little lights of Paddington yellow and remote. They stood there, dim little figures, and very close together. They whispered and became silent. Presently it seemed that something passed and Lewisham began talking in his magnificent vein. He likened the Serpentine to life and found meaning in the dark banks of Kensington Gardens and the remote bright lights. The long struggle, he said, and the lights at the end, though he really did not know what he meant by the lights at the end. Neither did Ethel, though the emotion was indisputable. We are fighting the world, he said, finding great satisfaction in the thought. All the world is against us, and we are fighting it all. We will not be beaten, said Ethel. How could we be beaten together? Said Lewisham. For you, I would fight a dozen worlds. It seemed a very sweet and noble thing for them under the sympathetic moonlight, almost indeed too easy for their courage, to be merely fighting the world. "You haven't been married ever long," said Madame Gadot with an insinuating smile, when she readmitted Ethel on Monday morning after Lewisham had been swallowed up by the schools. "No, I haven't very long," admitted Ethel. "You're very happy," said Madame Gadot, and sighed. "I was very happy," said Madame Gadot. Chapter 23. Mr. Chaffrey at Home. The golden mist of delight lifted a little on Monday, when Mr. and Mrs. G.E. Lewisham went to call on his mother-in-law and Mr. Chaffrey. Mrs. Lewisham went in evident apprehension, but clouds of glory still hung about Mr. Lewisham's head, and his manner was heroic. He wore a cotton shirt and linen collar, and a very nice black satin tie that Mrs. Lewisham had bought on her own responsibility during the day. She naturally wanted him to look all right. Mrs. Chaffrey appeared in the half-light of the passage as the top of a grimy cap over Ethel's shoulder and two black sleeves about her neck. She emerged as a small middle-aged woman, with a thin little nose between silver-rimmed spectacles, a weak mouth and perplexed eyes, a queer little dust-lined woman with the oddest resemblance to Ethel in her face. She was trembling visibly, with nervous agitation. She hesitated, peering, and then kissed Mr. Lewisham effusively. "And this is Mr. Lewisham," she said as she did so. She was the third thing feminine to kiss Lewisham since the promiscuous days of his babyhood. "I was so afraid there," she laughed hysterically. "You will excuse my saying that it's comforting to see you, honest like and young." "Not but for Ethel. He has been something dreadful," said Mrs. Chaffrey. "You didn't ought to have written about that mesmerizing, and of all letters, that which Jane wrote there. But he's waiting and listening." "Are we to go downstairs, Mum?" asked Ethel. "He's waiting for you there," said Mrs. Chaffrey. She held a dismal little oil lamp, and they descended a tenebrous spiral structure into an underground breakfast room lit by gas that shone through a partially frosted globe with cut-glass stars. That descent had a distinctly depressing effect upon Lewisham. He went first. He took a deep breath at the door. What on earth was Chaffrey going to say? Not that he cared, of course. Chaffrey was standing with his back to the fire, trimming his fingernails with his pocket knife. His gilt glasses were tilted forward so as to make an inflamed knob at the top of his long nose, and he regarded Mr. and Mrs. Lewisham over with them. Lewisham doubted his eyes for a moment, but it was positively a smile, an essentially waggish smile. "You've come back," he said quite cheerfully over Lewisham to Ethel. There was a hint of falsetto in his voice. "She has called to see her mother," said Lewisham. "You, I believe, are Mr. Chaffrey." "I would like to know who the deuce you are," said Chaffrey, suddenly tilting his head back so as to look through his glasses instead of over them, and laughing genially. "For thoroughgoing cheek, I'm inclined to think you take the cake. Are you the Mr. Lewisham to whom this misguided girl refers in her letter?" "I am." "Maggie," said Mr. Chaffrey to Mrs. Chaffrey, "there is a class of being upon whose delicacy is lost, to whom delicacy is practically unknown. Has your daughter got her marriage lines?" "Mr. Chaffrey," said Lewisham, and Mrs. Chaffrey exclaimed, "James, how can you?" Chaffrey shut his penknife with a click and slipped it into his vest pocket. Then he looked up again, speaking in the same equal voice. "I presume we are civilized persons, prepared to manage our affairs in a civilized way. My stepdaughter vanishes for 2 nights and returns with an alleged husband. I am at least not disposed to be careless about her legal position." "You ought to know her better," began Lewisham. "Why argue about it?" said Chaffrey gaily, pointing a lean finger at Ethel's gesture, "when she has 'em in her pocket. She may just as well show me now." "I thought so. Don't be alarmed at my handling them. Fresh copies can always be got at the nominal price of 2 and 7. Thank you. Lewisham, George Edgar. 1 and 20. And you, 1 and 20, I never did know your age, my dear. Exactly. And now your mother won't say. Student. Thank you. I am greatly obliged. Indeed, I am greatly relieved. And now, what have you got to say for yourselves in this remarkable affair? You had a letter, said Lewisham. I had a letter of excuses. The personalities I overlook. Yes, sir, they were excuses. You young people wanted to marry, and you seized an occasion. You did not even refer to the fact that you wanted to marry in your letter. Pure modesty. But now you have come here married. It disorganizes this household. It inflicts endless bother on people. But never mind that. I'm not blaming you. Nature's to blame. Neither of you know what you are in for yet. You will. You're married, and that is the great essential thing. Ethel, my dear, just put your husband's hat and stick behind the door. And you, sir, are you so good as to disapprove of the way in which I earn my living? Well, said Lewisham, yes, I'm bound to say I do. You are really not bound to say it. The modesty of inexperience will excuse you. Yes, but it isn't right. It isn't straight. Dogma, said Charfrey, dogma. What do you mean by dogma? Asked Lewisham. I mean dogma, but we must argue this out in comfort. It is our supper hour, and I'm not the man to fight against accomplished facts. We have intermarried. There it is. You must stop to supper, and you and I must thresh these things out. We've involved ourselves with each other, and we've got to make the best of it. Your wife and mine will spread the board, and we will go on talking. Why not sit in that chair instead of leaning on the back? This is a home, not a debating society. Humble in spite of my manifest frauds. That's better. And in the first place, I do so hope, Charfrey was suddenly very impressive, that you're not a dissenter. Eh? Said Lewisham. And then, no, I am not a dissenter. That's better, said Mr. Charfrey. I'm glad of that. I was just a little afraid, something in your manner. I can't stand dissenters. I've a peculiar dislike to dissenters. To my mind, it's the great drawback of this Clapham. You see, I have invariably found them deceitful. Invariably. He grimaced and dropped his glasses with a click against his waistcoat buttons. I'm very glad of that, he said, replacing them. The dissenter, the nonconformist conscience, the Puritan, you know, the vegetarian and total abstainer, and all that sort of thing, I cannot away with them. I have cleared my mind of cant and formulae. I have a nature essentially Hellenic. Have you ever read Matthew Arnold? Beyond my scientific reading. Ah, you should read Matthew Arnold, a mind of singular clarity. In him you would find a certain quality that is sometimes a little wanting of you scientific men. They are apt to be a little too phenomenal, you know, a little too objective. Now, I seek after noumena. Noumena, Mr. Lewisham, if you follow me. He paused, and his eyes behind his glasses were mildly interrogative. Ethel re-entered without her hat and jacket, and with a noisy square black tray, a white cloth, some plates and knives and glasses, and began to lay the table. I follow you, said Lewisham, reddening. He had not the courage to admit ignorance of this remarkable word. You state your case. I seek after noumena, repeated Charfrey with great satisfaction, and gesticulated with his hand, waving away everything but that. I cannot do with surfaces and appearances. I am one of those nympholepts. You know? Nympholepts. Must pursue the truth of things, the elusive fundamental. I make a rule. I never tell myself lies. Never. There are few who can say that. To my mind, truth begins at home, and for the most part stops there. Safest and seemliest, you know? With most men, with your typical dissenter par excellence, it's always gadding abroad, calling on the neighbours. You see my point of view? He glanced at Lewisham, who was conscious of an unwanted opacity of mind. He became wary as he could manage to be on the spur of the moment. It's a little surprising, you know, he said very carefully, if I may say so, and considering what's happened, to hear you. Speaking of truth, not when you understand my position, not when you see where I stand. That is what I am getting at. That is what I am naturally anxious to make clear to you now that we have intermarried, now that you are my stepson-in-law. You're young, you know, you're young, and you're hard and fast. Only years can give a mind tone, mitigate the varnish of education. I gather from this letter and your face that you are one of the party that participated in that little affair at Lagoon's. He stuck out his finger at a point he had just seen. By the by, that accounts for Ethel, he said. Ethel rapped down the mustard on the table. It does, she said, but not very loudly. But you had before met, said Charfrey. At Wortley, said Lewisham. I see, said Charfrey. I was one of those who arranged the exposure, said Lewisham. And now you have raised the matter, I am bound to say. I knew, interrupted Charfrey. But what a shock that was for Lagoon. He looked down on his toes for a moment, with the corners of his mouth tucked in. The hand dodge wasn't bad, you know, he said, with a queer sidelong smile. Lewisham was very busy for a moment, trying to get this remark in focus. I don't see it in the same light as you do, he explained at last. Can't get away from your moral bias, eh? Well, we'll go into all that, but apart from its moral merits, simply as an artistic trick, it was not bad. I don't know much about tricks. So few who undertake exposures do. You admit you never heard or thought of that before. The bladder, I mean. Yet, it's as obvious as tin tacks that a medium who's hampered at his hands will do all he can with his teeth, and what could be so self-evident as a bladder under one lapel? What could be? Yet I know psychic literature pretty well, and it's never been suggested even. Never. It's a perpetual surprise to me how many things are not thought by investigators. For one thing, they never count the odds against them, and that puts them wrong at the start. Look at it. I am by nature tricky. I spend all my leisure standing or sitting about and thinking up or practicing new little tricks, because it amuses me immensely to do so. The whole thing amuses me. Well, what is the result of these meditations? Take one thing. I know 48 ways of making raps, of which at least 10 are original. 10 original ways of making raps. His manner was very impressive, and some of them simply tremendous raps. There. A confirmatory rap exploded, as it seemed between Lewisham and Charfrey. Eh? Said Charfrey. The mantelpiece opened, a dropping fire, and the table went off under Lewisham's nose like a cracker. You see? Said Charfrey, putting his hands under the tail of his coat. The whole room seemed snapping its fingers at Lewisham for a space. Very well, and now take the other side. Take the severest test I ever tried. 2 respectable professors of physics, not Newtons, you understand, but good, worthy, self-important professors of physics, a lady anxious to prove there's a life beyond the grave, a journalist who wants stuff to write, a person, that is, who gets his living by these researches just as I do, undertook to test me. Test me? Of course, they had their other work to do, professing physics, professing religion, organizing research, and so forth. At the outside, they don't think an hour a day about it, and most of them had never cheated anybody in their existence, and couldn't, for example, travel without a ticket for a 3-mile journey and not get caught to save their lives. Well, you see the odds. He paused. Lewisham appeared involved in some interior struggle. You know, explained Charfrey, it was quite an accident you got me quite. The thing slipped out of my mouth. Or your friend with the flat voice wouldn't have had a chance. Not a chance. Lewisham spoke like a man who is lifting a weight. All this, you know, is off the question. I'm not disputing your ability, but the thing is, it isn't right. We're coming to that, said Charfrey. It's evident we look at things in a different light. That's it. That's just what we've got to discuss, exactly. Cheating is cheating, you can't get away with that. That's simple enough. Wait till I've done with it, said Charfrey, with a certain zest. Of course, it's imperative you should understand my position. It isn't as though I hadn't one. Ever since I read your letter, I've been thinking over that. Really, a justification. In a way, you might almost say I had a mission, a source of profit. You really don't see the beginning of it yet? Oh, but hang it, protested Lewisham. Ah, you're young, you're crude, my dear young man. You're only at the beginning of things. you really must concede a certain possibility of wider views to a man more than twice your age. But here's supper. For a little while, at any rate, we'll call a truce." Ethel had come in again bearing an additional chair, and Mrs. Chaffrey appeared behind her, crowning the preparations with a jug of small beer. The cloth, Lewisham observed as he turned towards it, had several undarned holes and discoloured places, and in the centre stood a tarnished cruet, which contained mustard, pepper, vinegar, and 3 ambiguous dried-up bottles. The bread was on an ample board with a pious rim, and an honest wedge of cheese loomed disproportionate on a little plate. Mr. and Mrs. Lewisham were seated facing one another, and Mrs. Chaffrey sat in the broken chair because she understood its ways. "This cheese is as nutritious and unattractive and indigestible as science," remarked Chaffrey, cutting and passing wedges. "But crush it so under your fork. Add a little of this good Dorset butter, a dab of mustard, pepper, the pepper is very necessary, and some malt vinegar, and crush it together. You get a compound called grab, and by no means disagreeable. So the wise deal with the facts of life, neither bolting nor rejecting, but adapting." "As though pepper and mustard were not facts," said Lewisham, scoring his solitary point that evening. Chaffrey admitted the collapse of his image in very complimentary terms, and Lewisham could not avoid a glance across the table at Ethel. He remembered that Chaffrey was a slippery scoundrel whose blame was better than his praise immediately afterwards. For a time, the crab engaged Chaffrey, and the conversation languished. Mrs. Chaffrey asked Ethel formal questions about their lodgings, and Ethel's answers were buoyant. "You must come and have tea one day," said Ethel, not waiting for Lewisham's endorsement, "and see it all." Chaffrey astonished Lewisham by suddenly displaying a complete acquaintance with his status as a South Kensington teacher in training. "I suppose you have some money beyond that guinea," said Chaffrey, offhandedly. "Enough to go on with," said Lewisham, reddening. "And you look to them at South Kensington to do something for you? 100 a year or so, when your scholarship is up?" "Yes," said Lewisham, a little reluctantly. "Yes, 100 a year or so. That's the sort of idea, and there's lots of places beyond South Kensington, of course, even if they don't put me up there." "I see," said Chaffrey, "but it will be a pretty close shave for all that 100 a year." Well, well, there's many a deserving man has to do with less, and after a meditative pause, he asked Lewisham to pass the beer. "Have you a mother living, Mr. Lewisham?" said Mr. Chaffrey suddenly, and pursued him through the tale of his connections. When he came to the plumber, Mrs. Chaffrey remarked with an unexpected air of consequence that most families have their poor relations.